Hello, everybody. Cheers and welcome. I am so excited you all are here. Um, yes, and so I'm leaving everything on. I don't have a lot to share today. We're going to keep this in kind of gallery mode so people can see each other and talk to each other. But hi, everybody. Everyone, I would like to introduce you all. I hope you can see him right now, to the lovely winemaker Ryan Pease of Paix Sur Terre.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. So I'm super excited that you guys all came and that you're here to meet him. I love these wines, and I'm really excited. This is also the first one. Ryan's my guinea pig. He's delightful, a lovely human being to do that. But this is a great opportunity, I think. What my goal is for this seminar and the whole series is for you guys to get to know people, right? Trent, I see you there. Hi, Trent. You had mentioned that you were going to go up to visit Paso Robles, your next Paso trip, didn't you?
That's right, yeah. They were on the list.
I'd love to have you.
I'm super interested. When we get to sort of the end, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let Ryan do a lot of kind of sharing of information, because I think that's what we're all here to learn more from him. But I definitely, at the end, please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to keep the chat box open. So if you want to ask questions to Ryan directly, you can always, I mean, there's not a lot of us here, you guys. So if you want to, pipe up, obviously you're welcome to, but you can also just type a question in and I can get it out to him. But I just want to say, this is just a great opportunity, I think, to learn about wine, what makes it special, and the people who obviously care about what they do, which I think is great. So if you all have the wine, I hope some of you do. I think a few people have it, but obviously we are going to start out with the beautiful Peak Pool. Yeah, everyone, we can see these labels, right? Which we'll talk about. But so we've got the Peak Pool to start with, and then we've got the beautiful Counoise. I was just having a conversation about how I pronounce it both ways, because I've always said Counoise before, but technically, as Ryan has just informed me, it is a Counoise. It is a hard S in French. Thank you very much. And then our Morvette is going to end the conversation, but I'm talking a whole lot, and instead of doing that, I'm going to say, Ryan, please introduce yourself.
Of course. Well, welcome everybody. Nice to see you all and meet you. My name is Ryan, and not originally from this area, originally from Walnut Creek in the Bay Area, and went to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. It's our local college here that many of you I'm sure know of, and never left the area, just kind of fell in love. And my degree actually is in finance is what I studied. But when I was working for Edward Jones towards the end of my finance studies, I was realizing pretty quickly I hated working in an office, and it was not going to be a sustainable career for me from a happiness standpoint. So I actually applied for a tasting room position, and there was an ad up on the Mustang jobs board for a winery called Linné Coloto, of which I had never heard of. I didn't know anything about Paso wines. I was just like, I'll throw a resume in and see what happens, and go up for my interview and get the job. And turns out they were one of the original cult producers of Rhône varietals in the state of California. Mm-hmm. And right when I had started working there, Robert Parker had just bestowed them a 95 points plus on their entire 2004 vintage across the board. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm somewhere pretty significant here. Then coming up was the Harvest 2007, and 2007 Harvest is generally regarded as one of the greatest vintages in California history. The wine that pretty much put Paso on the map came from that vintage, which was Saxum's James Berry Vineyard 2007, that got 100 points, was the first 100-point wine out of Paso, and also was rated the #1 wine in the world by Wine Spectator back in 2009. So that vintage was the first thing I ever saw via one of the best Rhône producers in the state of California. And it was a pretty easy decision that this would be a great alternative to me working in finance. My office could be a vineyard and a cellar. And so I pursued that a little further, did a harvest, stayed in school for one more year, and got a minor in viticulture, just studying the growing side of things, because I already had the business side down, and I was learning winemaking in the cellar from a master. So I figured that would give me a well-rounded education moving forward. And so that's kind of how I happenstance fell into the business, was literally one day just threw a resume at a winery that I never knew about, and ended up getting a dream job right from the start in this business. And most people have to work their way up. doing internships, scrubbing drains for Gallo or some large production winery, and it takes years and years and years to truly learn how to make wine. Well, after 1 year working for this guy, I already had plans to start my own brand after that because he was teaching me everything, and I was doing everything hands-on. So that's kind of the background of how I got started in this thing. And I ended up going on to work for Epic for a winery for a couple of years during their when they're first getting started, literally developing their brand at that time, and then got to then work for Neil Collins, who is the winemaker for Tablas Creek and also the owner of Lone Madrone. And those were my first 3 jobs in the business, were for 3 of literally the most respected brands in the area. So kind of lucked out there big time.
Yeah.
Yeah, like big time. And so 2009 was when I started conceiving the idea for our brand. And then 2010 was when I picked our first fruit and made our first wines. We started off with 144 cases back in 2010, made just 6 barrels. And have grown steadily since then. And now we're doing about 1,500 cases a year and have a tasting room on Vineyard Drive. So yeah, it's been nice to grow slowly but surely over the years. And so that's kind of my background in general. No formal winemaking training whatsoever. Never even taken a chemistry course before. Literally just learned from people that are the best at what they do in this industry, and was lucky enough to have them let them teach me, or that they were willing to teach me first and foremost. But gave me all the opportunities to work in the vineyard, work in the cellar, work in the tasting room. While simultaneously my wife was doing more of the tasting room, wine club management, and overall managerial duties. So she and I combined pretty much covered every department of what makes a winery function, and allowed the 2 of us to run our brand without any really salaried employees at all. Just the 2 of us plus our 2 tasting room attendants. So that's kind of how our background got us to this point today. I'm currently the head winemaker for Brecken Estate. I started with them back in February, right before the pandemic, thankfully. That worked out pretty good. But yeah, just been having, this will be my first harvest coming up for them. So always, us young people in this business that don't come from millions and millions of dollars and own big vineyards and estates and things, a lot of us do work full-time as winemakers for other wineries, just to kind of help us have that steady, it's nice to have that steady paycheck and health insurance when you're trying to grow a business, and the ups and downs of things like a pandemic and things like that. Just nice to have that steady paycheck along the way, especially when you have 2 kids like I do that are 1 and 3.
Yes, right, because you also, and I'm sure they love helping out in the vineyard, do they?
Yeah, they do. They love going to the tasting room, love coming and helping pick fruit and things like that, and stomping grapes. And there's, as at 1 and 3, they're at that age. I can't really have them at the tasting room much right now because they do more harm than good. But but they like to get involved whenever they can, which is pretty nice.
I am going to jump really quickly just to our first wine, because what I want to touch back on, what you just mentioned, was kind of, you said in 2009 you started coming up with the concept for your winery, for your brand. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what that was when it started and how you sort of built that based on what you've already done.
Yeah.
But first, yeah, oh, sorry.
But yeah,
but I wanted to mention,
glass if you have it.
yeah.
And I'll go through the concept of kind of what our brand's idea was going into it, but then I'll kind of go into the peak pool because that'll kind of segue into what's changed with that plan along the way.
Yeah.
So initially, when we started our brand, I was a big fan of Mourvedre. The wines of Bandol specifically were, to me, the most amazing wines made on earth. Were an incredible value, incredibly age-worthy. And working in some of the great cellars in Paso, you start tasting all these Mourvedre barrels and going, wow, these are amazing. Why is nobody doing this as a primary thing, as a brand? Everybody's just blending their Mourvedres away into their Syrahs and Grenaches and making these GSMs and things. And these Mourvedres here are spectacular and perfectly standalone. So I went in initially thinking I was going to build the brand completely off Mourvedre for the most part, or almost entirely, do Mourvedre Rosé, do several single vineyard Mourvedres, stuff along those lines. But then things kind of morphed because I started getting offered really cool, unique blending grapes that are very obscure and hard to find and rarely done on their own because my peers liked so much what I was doing with Mourvedre. Started getting offered things like our Uni Blanc, which is one of the white wines we do that just got back-to-back 95 points from Wine Enthusiast. and there's only 1 acre in entire existence in all of Paso. And the last 2 years it was the highest scoring white wine in Paso. So you kind of luck into things like that say, well, yeah, I have to do that. That's too special not to. And then down the road, Peak Pool, Claret Blanche, Counoise, and fun things of those natures. That's just what I found I enjoyed doing, is those more obscure varietals, because I think doing something that's generally regarded as a blending grape and making 100% varietal version of it that's quite spectacular on its own, to me is like the hardest thing to do as a winemaker and the greatest challenge. And that's what makes it fun for me. So this Peak Pool, kind of being part of that ideology of it, came along the way. When I was working for Lone Madrone for Neil Collins, he planted a new site that had Peak Pool on it. So eventually he moved on from the Glenrose Vineyard Peak Pool, and this stuff fell into my lap simply because of my affiliation with him. And I had made it for him for about 2 or 3 years. So I already knew there was this great fruit. And when the contract expired, I jumped on it and took this wine kind of in my own direction. And Peak Pool, generally, especially in France, has a pretty bad reputation for being just very neutral and a high acid wine that you would just have as a carafe wine in a cafe in France, and isn't taken particularly serious there. Well, these are low yielding vines on pure limestone terraces that are 20 years old, and that plants themselves are 20 years old. So the pedigree is as great as anything in Paso. So it elevates what's considered a blending grape to something far more spectacular than that. And you get this wine here that's got this great refreshing acidity, but tons of these like tropical fruit notes, lots of citrus notes. And then when you taste it, it's really refreshing and acidic, but there's some body there at the same time too, and a whole cornucopia of flavors that come your way. And the cool thing about this wine is because it's made from 2 sections of Peak Pool at the same vineyard, there's 2 different flavors essentially being put into this wine, hence why you get this more citrusy note with these more tropical fruit notes. Because one of the blocks is on an east-facing slope of limestone that barely gets any sun. It just sees morning sun. The entire afternoon it's in the shade. So it doesn't get very ripe. It's very citrusy, very limey, very tart, very acidic, very mineral, but something that's kind of austere on its own and would be kind of difficult to make as a standalone wine. On the other part of the property, what's called the Summit, which is a south-facing slope at 1,800 feet elevation, it is a fully exposed, super hot spot for Peak Pool, and that stuff gets really tropical. Lots of stone fruit, tropical notes, very fruity, no citrus, lower acidity. So what I do is I pick them at the same time, and I press them together, and I co-ferment them together. So you're almost taking 2 completely different wines that are growing out there, and making them one via co-fermentation. It's the only way to do it. You can't make them separate and then blend them together. It won't work the same way. You have to make them one at ferment, essentially. And that's what I think is so unique about this wine. Peak Pool generally is more of a 1 or 2 note wine, whereas this thing's got 4, 5, 6 notes going on in it because of the 2 components in it.
It has this beautiful layering quality, and it does all those things. It has exactly that refreshing sort of acidity and that beautiful kind of like peaky minerality in the back too, but it is well-rounded and sort of fleshed out with that. So I just have a couple of questions. You mentioned the Glenrose Vineyard, which I know you use for a couple other of your wines too. Yes. If we, does that vineyard, for example, do the vines for the Peak Pool come from the Talbot Creek original cuttings?
Yes, yes. So Glenrose is unique because first off, it was planted between 94 and 98, which was before Nicole existed, before Saxum existed, before Leventour existed, before Rhône was even a thing. This guy planted an entire 60 acres plus on a 500-acre property to mostly Rhône varietals. And these were literally the first cuttings that came out of Talbot Creek's nursery.
Who was it that planted the vineyard, and why?
Don Rose is his name. He's still the owner. He was the one that carved the terraces himself with a bulldozer and planted these vines that were literally the first cuttings that Talbot Creek released. So this is the oldest planting of those clones outside of Talbot Creek's property anywhere in the state of California, or I should say anywhere in the country. So that's unique to this, that these vines pretty much predate the Rhône movement. And then here I am getting to use these completely mature vines to make these beautiful wines It makes my life really easy personally. I mean, just don't screw these up is really kind of the mantra at the end of the day, because it's amazing terroir, amazing dirt, great clonal selections, and farmed
Yeah.
beautifully. So there's really, I'm being given almost perfect inputs into the wine. It's just a matter of guiding it the right direction.
Right.
So that's kind of what's unique about Glen Rose. It's why I think half of our wines in our portfolio come from that vineyard, because there's nothing like it. I mean, there's literally, you cannot, it's an irreplaceable combination of terroir and vine age that literally doesn't exist anywhere else in Paso.
I think Dan might have just put Glen Rose as his background. Did you?
Yes, you did. That's a beautiful. That's the summit right there. So we also call it Machu Picchu because it literally looks like an enormous pyramid, and you can just see the vines just shooting across there. They're all on terraces, which are wonderful for winemakers because they're flat, and you get the quality that comes from hillside, high elevation vineyards. But instead of being downslope where the top ripens early, the middle in the middle, and then the bottom at the end, and you almost have 3 picks on that slope if you planted top down. In this case, you can pick them terrace at a time kind of thing, and the uniformity is there. So it makes the picks really easy. It means I can grab a terrace all in one pick. You don't have to dissect it. And so the wine is essentially made on one pick rather than multiple picks and then having to blend down the road.
Now, do you? I have a couple other questions here too, but I have one of my own first. So, when you're harvesting these, do you actually go personally harvest them, or do you just kind of guide them as to when you'd like them picked?
I just tell them when I want to pick. They pick about 2 o'clock in the morning, and on the long hours I'm working during harvest, that is the time I absolutely better be sleeping, or I will not be able to function. So they start picking about midnight under lights, and pick till about 10 o'clock in the mornings, or 9ish, depending on how hot it is that day. But it gives them the chance to give pickers a full shift. Back in the day, before night picks were the norm, you could only really pick from like 6:30 to 10. And it was not very fair to the crews because they would be driving from far distant places where obviously the cost of living is lower for these shifts, and only getting 3 or 4 hours just wasn't financially viable for them. So we'd turn around and move them into the vineyard to do some vineyard work and things of that nature. But it was inefficient from that standpoint. But now with night picks, they can work from like midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning. They get a full shift. We can pick more fruit in one day than we could ever before, which really helps at the same time too. So yeah, the picking time is when I'm sleeping. And then by the time I wake up, get to the winery, do my punch downs, the fruit shows up and we start processing.
Amazing.
So the timing's perfect.
There was a quick question because when we were talking about the co-fermentation,
Mhm.
and just sort of speaking to that a little bit about what is it about co-fermentation that creates a different experience than the blending afterwards? The question is, why can't you blend afterwards?
So I liken it to if you have roommates when you're young and in college versus roommates when you're 40 plus. When you're in college, you're still young, you're still adaptable, you're flexible, you're willing to make concessions in your life a little bit more to having other people in the home that have different perspectives or different cleanliness standards and sleep schedules and all that kind of stuff. And you just kind of roll with the punches. You're 20 years old, whatever, life's good. Well, 40 plus or so, you're who you are, and you don't want to compromise for things like that. You don't want dirty dishes in the sink. And the older you get, the harder it is to deal with the roommate situation. And that's kind of a similar kind of with co-fermentation. If you put them together early and young and start them off together, they become this cohesive unit. They become great roommates that make a beautiful wine. By the time, if you do them separately, by the time you age them, they go dry, they settle, and then you go to blend them, they just don't come together the same way. They conflict with each other, and it tastes manufactured in a way, like you tried to put something together rather than it just being completely cohesive via co-fermentation. So anytime you're trying to add flavors to a wine, whether it's little percentages of like Viognier and a Syrah, things of that nature, co-fermentation or during the fermentation is by far the best time to do it, because you just won't achieve the same thing doing it down the road.
Yeah. And going back to the vines, these lovely Glen Rose vines, for these particular people, are these the original plantings? And B, if they're that old, how much longer do you think they're gonna keep making this fruit before they have to start replanting?
Good question. So these are the original plants that were planted in '98. So they have real thick trunks and such. But now vines used to, as you know, with all of our old vines in vineyards in California, you live 80, 100, 120 years. Nowadays, we're not seeing that as much because there's more disease issues in the vineyards from red blotch specifically in Utaipa. So our vine health is not as consistent as it used to be, and as a result, most vineyards are having to be replanted every 25 to 30 years. So a lot of the vineyards around here that were planted in the 90s at this point are starting to show such a strong level of disease that they either have to be ripped out, or you have to cut them back literally to the head or the trunk and then start growing out new wood and laying it down and laying down new cordons at that point, so that you can get back up to normal production per se. So I'm hoping these vines, because it is an organic vineyard, it's extremely well taken care of. The crew that works on these vines is 100% works at Glenrose Vineyard and is employed by them, which means in theory they're using clean shears, they're not transferring disease from other sites. I hope these vines last the rest of my life. And we're doing things to try to mitigate the issues that could make them go away sooner. But for now, I think they at least have another couple decades ahead of them. I don't think there's any reason they wouldn't be able to do that as long as we keep up the program that we're doing there.
This is great. The questions are coming in, and I love it. I have a question, which is you're talking about you're seeing more disease, and I'm just curious which diseases you're kind of seeing most prominent or any taking off. But there's also Suzanne. Dan's picture is the Glenrose Vineyard that we're talking about right now, actually.
Yes.
The vineyard, yeah. So that's the vineyard that the grapes for the peak pool are coming from right now. And then also, do you know if Glenrose is dry farmed?
It's minimally irrigated is what we call it. Basically, when you're farming on pure limestone like this, because those terraces literally cut all the topsoil out of them, these vines grow out of literally white rock limestone. It's more like hydroponic farming than it is farming in normal dirt, because there really is no dirt. It's literally vines and rock. So you can get away irrigating very little because limestone holds a lot of moisture from the winter, and the roots go way down through the cracks and fissures and get really deep in the limestone. But like this past week, when we're hit with temperatures of 110 to 114 degrees for a week straight, you've got to give the vines water, or especially at the tip top of the hill, they will die. I mean, they will literally lose all their leaves, and you lose your crop completely for the year. Especially a variety like Movedras, who's very susceptible to the leaf fail problem that I specified there. And so we just water when we need to, basically during key times like flowering and veraison, when the clusters turn from green to red. We don't want the plant stressed at those times because you want that to be uniform. So they'll give them some irrigation then. And then as we move towards harvest during heat spikes, we always give them a drink before the heat and during the heat and then after, just to ensure that they get through it just fine. And some varieties are different than others. Grenache doesn't need as much water. Movedra needs quite a bit of water. And it really just depends. At east-facing slope, it's cooler. It doesn't need as much, but everything on that summit that's in Dan's picture, that's pure south-facing limestone slope. It's hot as heck on that slope. So that's an exposure that you absolutely need to irrigate here and there.
And then in terms of the kind of the disease in Paso, or is it something just generally in California that you're seeing, or is it more of a reference to like?
No, it's across the whole industry. Part of the problem with outsourcing labor is you have the pruning shears of these crews going to multiple vineyards, and that is a way that disease is transferred. Diseases like phylloxera, which are highly detrimental to vines that aren't on rootstock, can get transferred just on the workers' boots, literally from vineyard to vineyard. And then the pruning shears can go from even vine to vine within the same site, can spread disease. So your timing of pruning is really crucial. A lot of people now have their pruning shears sanitized when they switched over to a new site, so that at least the problems within a site stay within that site. I know some obsessive enough that sanitize between each vine, essentially, and they do that at James Berry Vineyard at Saxum. Granted, they at $100 price point, who with a 10-year waiting list, they financially have the resources to do things like that, because it's more time sensitive, but and a lot more expensive labor-wise, but they can do that kind of thing. So it really just depends, I guess, on how deep your pockets are for what level of cleanliness and sanitation you're doing to not pass those diseases around for the most part.
So I'm so excited because I was planning on asking you already about the weather and the fires up there, but let's talk about our wine number 2, just because we can kind of share that and people can enjoy it. So if we talk about, you guys don't have to drink it, but if you have it open, you want to drink it, go for it. I got smart. I've been getting smart, you guys. I've been pouring out my glasses ahead of time, so I'm not like fumbling around. I'm kind of semi-professional. But so with the Counoise, so I think that one of the things I know that you have a passion for, kind of like these Rhône varietals, and I feel like it's part of how you were brought up and you got the great introduction to them, right? So this is one that I think is super fun because it's very rare to see it as a single varietal, right? And so I'd love to hear kind of, well, first of all, obviously about the wine, kind of your own experience with it, but what you find so special about this particular grape.
Yeah, so this was another one of those. Loma Drone moved on to another site that they planted, and I got to take their old Counoise at Glenrose. And so this is another one that fell into my lap, and I had actually been making this wine for Loma Drone for a few years, but there was also Cinsault on the property, which is another variety kind of similar to Counoise, but it's more of a purple fruit, blue fruit kind of flavors. And we were actually blending those together to make what was called their La Mezcla Roja, which was basically this light, bright, refreshing, high acid, low alcohol red wine, something you could actually put in the fridge, put a chill on it, and have this red that's not wussy or weak by any means, still has plenty of flavor, but it's just crushable. It's just drinks like something you just open on the patio with a couple friends and you blink and the bottle's gone. And only 13.5% alcohol, you can do things like that. So it's a red that drinks like a white wine is kind of the concept of this wine. And again, these are 20-year-old Counoise vines planted in the same situation as the peak pool is. So this is, to me, this is the most pedigreed Counoise fruit anywhere in Paso. Even at Tablas Creek, they have Counoise there, but it's planted in some of the lower spots of their vineyards that you wouldn't consider a prime spot. This is literally the best 3 rows of Counoise that exist in Paso. Goes into this wine by far. There's not even a comparable. And so that's kind of, again, one that just fell into my lap. But Counoise generally is a variety that maybe is shut enough to pop 1 or 2% in the wine. I mean, tiny little amounts. You rarely even see it in rosé production. It's just there's not a lot of acreage over there, and there's very, very little in the United States. But as you can taste, it's just fresh. It's really, really fun. I kind of describe it as like fresh farmer's market strawberries. It's just got this effusively beautiful farmer's market fresh red fruit going on to it. But then there's some complexity in the mouthfeel. There's some kind of a meaty, earthy quality that comes out with some time. You really get that refreshing limestone, that kind of briny, salty thing at the end that makes your mouth water. And I love to have this with like a watermelon feta mint salad during the summer. Something that's just very refreshing and light and bright is one of my favorite pairings for this wine.
Everyone writing that down, I hope.
Yeah. Super simple. Just get farmer's market watermelon, cut it up into cubes, sprinkle some feta and mint in there. It's one of the best things you could ever have. And if you want to make it more substantial, you can put some quinoa in it just to give it a little addition there. But it's one of my favorite pairings for this wine.
What a delightful, because are you drinking yours slightly chilled, out of curiosity?
Mine is a little bit chilled, but I brought it from the tasting room about an hour ago, so it hasn't been in the fridge for a little bit. But it drinks great without a chill, but during the summer, it's kind of nice when you don't want to quite drink it at white wine temperature per se, but that kind of middle ground between white wine and red wine temperature is perfect.
Yeah. So I want to read you a tasting note that is from Nancy. I just think it's a beautiful tasting note. So she's saying the only time she's ever had 100% Counoise is from Domaine, I'm going to butcher this probably, de Piogier from Sablé. She owned the wine shop where we had your Uni Blanc on our wine club. She's saying that was rich, but this one is more elegant and silky.
Oh, lovely. That's great to hear. That's kind of how Counoise should be, as far as I'm concerned. Another way I kind of accentuate this great brightness is I bottle it after only 2 months. It's again treated like a white wine. It just goes into neutral barrels and then just gets filtered for clarity, because obviously being such a young red wine, it's pretty dirty at that point. And then it goes to kind of capture that effusively fresh moment. It's a time in the cellar, like in the winter post-harvest, that consumers never get to taste wines out of barrel for the most part.
No.
But at the time, these wines have this electric freshness to them, and the acidities are super bright, and the fruit is so primary and beautiful and fresh. And eventually that disappears the longer you leave it in barrel as it breathes. And so my idea is I want to capture that, and I'll let it slowly dissipate and bottle because it'll breathe through the cork, and it'll overall, after a couple of years, get meatier and earthier, and some of that freshness will be curtailed. But I want that moment to be captured in bottle so that it can be a very slow evolution. Whereas if I did this in barrel, it would evolve past this stage so quickly I'd miss it and be gone forever.
Are you recommending, what's your aging recommendation for this wine, for example, for cellaring?
So it is a wine I'm sure you could cellar 5 to 7 years, but I don't know that you would want to per se. I mean, I think what's so beautiful about it is its effusive freshness now. I've had some aged Counoise before, and they're delicious, and they get really meaty and earthy. The kind of wine you can almost have with a steak at that point, but why, per se? Is it like, to me, this effusively fresh fruit is why I bottle it the way it is. So I tell people, like the 2018 last year's, still bright and fresh, but it's starting to dissipate a little bit. So yeah. I recommend the Counoise to drink it. As I say with our whites and our Counoise, they're seasonal wines. They're wines that I always release in the spring, and drink them that summer and spring, and next year the next one will be around, kind of thing. So I think those are wines that I think are best drunk in that first year, because that's the moment I captured, and after that year, it's gone. That's gone. And then, so drink them fresh, and then I'll have the next vintage for you coming up for the next season, kind of thing. What I encourage people. The reds are bigger, richer reds. Yeah, lay them down. They're beautiful. They absolutely get better with age, and there's a reason to lay those down. But that's not the point of the whites and the Counoise, what I'm trying to achieve.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of quick questions. I have a question from Laura, who's asking if you work with Bill Frick from Dry Creek.
I have not. I have not before. I don't think I've met Bill before.
And then there's also I have a couple questions here. There's a question about Stelvin closures. Have you ever considered using Stelvin screw caps on your wine?
I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I love corks just because I like the traditional aspect of like hearing that pop. I like sticking that corkscrew in there and pulling it out. And also too, my winemaking style is a reductive winemaking style, in the sense that I add as little oxygen to my wines as possible. And I want them riding the fine line of being slightly reductive to the point, but not so much that you can taste it or smell it. And reduction is just basically a deprivation of oxygen with wines. And if you reduce, or a wine is too reduced, it'll start to smell kind of rubbery. It'll have this kind of stinky funk to it that's kind of hard to describe. You only know it if you're in the wine business, and you smell it in an instant, you just know that's reduction. It can even come off kind of metallic. That's when a wine is oxygen starved, essentially. And that creates a problem from a flavor standpoint. But my idea of this is I want them just barely slightly reductive to the point that it's not perceivable, but there's no signs of oxidation whatsoever. A screw cap would work against me in that standpoint, because if I put that wine, I would actually have to use copper sulfate to make the wine slightly oxidative, so that when I screw capped it and it reduced back, because it's in an oxygen deprived environment, I would still be in the same place, essentially. So you'd kind of play this, you'd have to play this game of, I would need to oxidize it to then screw cap it, essentially, to make up for the reduction that would come. The cork allows me just to bottle the wine at the exact moment I want it, and let it be what it is, and then let it continue to progress from there.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
Oh, you're fine. So that was basically, I just finished. That's basically how my winemaking style works for the most part. Whereas others that work in a more oxidative style, a Stelvin screw cap would be highly beneficial to them.
Yeah. I just have never, you're getting a lot of feedback where this is a really wonderful answer. Thank you. But it's also, I've never actually considered the fact of, intellectually, I understand the fact that you get a little bit of oxygen coming through the cork, but I never think about that in terms of the entire the winemaking process. So that explanation, that understanding of it that way, thank you. Um,
Of course.
it's just interesting. I've never thought of it that way before, and it makes
another interesting, like Tobless Creek's done some experiments over the year where they've actually bottled the same wine in both screw cap and cork as an experiment to kind of see long term how they would age. And the screw cap definitely allows the wine to age longer. There's no doubt about it. It keeps it fresher. It keeps the fruit brighter for longer. But it doesn't get to where it gets with the cork as far as getting that meatier, earthier qualities that come out. It almost never gets to that point. And so there's something gained, something lost, essentially. So with the screw cap, you might gain freshness for longer, but then you never get the benefits of what a cork gives you 5, 8, 10 years down the road at the same time too. That screw cap wine will never get there. So again, it just kind of depends what your palate is. Do you want these effusively fresh wines, or do you want wines that will develop and change over time? Or in the case of us, it's like, well, why not have the best of both worlds? I'll bottle it slightly reductive as if it's in a screw cap, and then I'll let it take on oxygen over time in the bottle and eventually get to the benefits of what a cork gives you. But my idea is to kind of give you the best of both worlds while using cork at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. Do you know if when you use a wax covering over the cork, it has the same effect as a screw cap, or is there a little bit of oxygen that comes through the wax?
As far as I know, there's still oxygen going through there. I used to wax my bottles in the early days, and I didn't notice any difference per se. They seem to evolve just like any of my other wines. We stopped using wax, I think, in 2014 vintage, mostly just because our artist was getting so good at what he was doing. I didn't feel like the wax was really necessary anymore. And we buy really nice corks. We put a nice vintage end brand on it. So when you're cellar, you can kind of see what vintage you're pulling out. And I really just scraped the wax off one of our bottles one day and just went, why do I have this on here even? And there's no point anymore. And because our labels used to be a little simpler than this, but his style has kind of developed over the years. And actually, I had more customers thank me for getting rid of the wax than that had a problem with it. I literally only had one customer complain, and I had many come to me and say, thank you for getting rid of the wax. It's a pain in the butt. It's hard to open. And I thought it actually made our product look better, and people were happier. So it was a win-win all around. And it's a lot less labor and cost to do it without the wax.
Right. And you don't even use that. Yeah, the capsules or anything. Nancy is asking a little bit about, Paix Sur Terre is a winery. Your tasting room is located on
Drive.
But you source from multiple vineyards in Paso. Glenrose is obviously the main one that we've been talking about, which is West Side Paso, correct? In that Adelaida district?
Yes, correct.
And then, but where are some of the other vineyards that you source from?
So, Glenrose is right next to Law Estate, Calcareous, kind of out in that neighborhood in the Peachy Canyon area, which is technically, he's just barely in the Adelaida district. Then I also source from Denner Vineyards, which is just down the road from our tasting room. That's at a little lower elevation, but one of the best sites in this area. Another vineyard I source from is Alta Colina Vineyard. They're out on Adelaida Road. Those two obviously have wineries behind them and they're a great estate, great farmers, and are already growing grapes for $50 to $80 price point wines. So they're just a pleasure to work with because they just do everything well, really well, because they have the same end game I do. Essentially, they're trying to make a premium bottle of wine. So anytime I visit those vineyards, I can't tell myself, why did I even come out here other than to take a nice walk, because everything's perfect all the time, because we're in the same game together making premium wine. Glenrose is a little different because he's just a farmer, so he needs a lot more guidance from that standpoint. And then our other vineyards, where the Uni Blanc comes from, is called Maison Mason Vineyard. That's on Kyler Canyon Road over by Ecluse Winery. And then we also have Paper Street Vineyard that our Claret comes from, which is actually right next to Glenrose as well. And then Yankowski Vineyard, which our Graciano Movedra co-ferment comes from. And that's on Old Stagecoach Road, which is off of Peachy Canyon as well. So again, these are all West Side vineyards. As the crow flies, there's maybe at most 1.5 miles, 2 miles between them. But as those of you who have been to Paso, you know how many different hills and exposures we have and how all the roads here kind of meander through. And it might take you 20, 25 minutes to get just two vineyards that are literally a mile as the crow flies apart from each other, just simply because of our geography here. So all west side, all heavily marine influenced vineyards, all at elevation. And these are the 4 or 5 vineyards that I just absolutely love working with, and kind of are the cream of the crop.
And your wines are all just individual single vineyards, or do you sometimes blend between those vineyards?
Always single vineyards. So the whole idea with our wines is I want purity and sense of place. So I want not regional blends that's a Paso Robles Grenache. I want Glenrose Vineyard Grenache, or Glenrose Vineyard Mourvedre, or Denner Mourvedre. I want, it's generally one single variety from one single place. Because to me, if you can make a spectacular standalone wine from one variety from one single place, that's to me the pinnacle of winemaking. There's no blending, there's nothing to hide behind. There's not even any new oak on our wines whatsoever. And if you can do literally a beautiful standalone wine from one grape from one place with no inputs whatsoever, just let it be what it is and it's beautiful, that to me is the greatest challenge. And to me, at the end of the day, what I want all of our wines to be. So I do 2 wines that have 2 varieties in them. Our Grenache-based wine from Glenrose is about 60-40 Grenache Mourvedre, because they just complement each other so beautifully, but it's still very Grenache forward. The nose is just beautiful Grenache. The palate's almost all Grenache, but then the finish, you get that Mourvedre. And then our other one from Yankowski Vineyard is our Graciano Mourvedre, which is about 60% Graciano, 40% Mourvedre. Those are co-fermented together, but that wine was a total accident.
It's a great story.
Because that Graciano was supposed to be Monastrell, which was the Spanish clone of Mourvedre. And I co-fermented the 2 together, and it was making what was supposed to be the 4th Mourvedre in my lineup, which was going to be my Spanish style Mourvedre, that was called Monastrell. And then it turns out that the Monastrell that was planted in Paso, or actually in California in general, over 200 acres worth, was not Mourvedre. It was Graciano. And so first 2 versions of my Yankowski Graciano Mourvedre were labeled as Monastrell, actually. And then we found out a week after bottling my second version of it that it was indeed Graciano, and going forward there was a blend on the label.
It's still a beautiful wine. I know it's not in our lineup today, but I highly encourage everyone to either go up and try it, and or procure some. It's a fun story to hear about that. Because who originally planted the Gracianos, the Monastrell?
So Andrew Jones, who owns I think it was Sunridge Nursery, and also Field Recordings Winery. He's the one that got the cuttings, and brought it over here. We were all so excited to get a new clone of Mourvedre. It was something we hadn't had in a long time in this business, and we were all so excited about it. I mean, we planted the heck out of that thing. I mean, places like Saxum, Lenny Coloto, L'Aventure planted acres and acres of it, thinking, yay, we're getting a fun new clone to play with. And then the first crop hit, and the site I sourced from actually got the vines a year ahead of everybody else. So I actually harvested the first Monastrell crop in Paso. And when I went to go sample it one day, thinking I've got a few weeks to go because Mourvedre is pretty late, it was ready. And I was like, okay, this is bizarre. This is about 3 weeks too early. So I took a sample back to the winery and ran the numbers on it, and the chemistry was nothing even resembling Mourvedre. It was extremely high sugar. The pH was the lowest pH I've ever seen on red wine. It was the color of Petit Syrah. And I was just like, well, what I don't know. I have to call it Monastrell. It's legally called that in the United States. That's what that clone registered as. But it's pretty clear it wasn't Mourvedre. And when I made that first wine from it, it was absolutely stunningly beautiful. I didn't know really what it was, but it was wonderful. And we made it again in 2016. And 2016 is when everybody else's vineyards came on, and everybody started chatting about how there's no way this is Mourvedre. And then Saxum actually sent cuttings to UC Davis to be genetically tested, and it came back as Graciano. And the way we figured out this mistake happened is Graciano in Spain is called Moristel. Nobody's ever in the United States heard of that moniker of Monastrell or for Graciano. So they think it was just a language barrier. The Spanish guy said, here's the Moristel, and the American said, thanks for the Monastrell. And there we are, 230 acres later.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Only one winery sued them. All the rest of us were pretty much just like, it's really good. Thanks. Don't do that again, but not a bad mistake whatsoever. Some have maybe grafted over a couple acres to Mourvedre because they actually needed Mourvedre acreage sort of thing. But for the most part, Graciano's here to stay in Paso, and it does really well and makes a really beautiful wine. So it's, again, something that kind of came out of nowhere, which is very similar to like the Tablas Creek story with Tannat and Vermentino. When they were bringing in their first cuttings from France, the vineyard guy at Chateau de Beaucastel just threw in the cuttings of Tannat and Vermentino. And when the cuttings showed up in the U.S. And the Haasses and the Perrins opened up the boxes, there were all these Vermentino and Tannat vines, and they called the Chateau de Beaucastel and said, we didn't order this. And the vineyard guy said, no, I just thought I'd put those in there because I thought they would thrive over there. And so they planted them, and their Vermentino is the best domestic Vermentino in the United States by far. And the Tannat is something that's a huge player in Paso now too, and makes beautiful wines. So kind of funny when things happen like that. It could be a bad mistake if it was like German Blaufränkisch or something like that can only grow in cool climates and very northern hemisphere locations. That would have been a problem. But these three incidences essentially worked out pretty good in the end, and it's here to stay.
Yeah. So we're as we sort of ease into the final quarter of this moment. We have been talking a lot about Mourvedre, so we should just go ahead and talk about that. But two things that I definitely want to touch on. One is the labels, and talking a little bit about your artist and the situation with that, because I know it's a huge. People always. I love your labels, and I know you get a lot of commentary on that. In your tasting room, I know you have his artwork up, but a little bit about the relationship. And then again, getting back to kind of like current events, in terms of the fires, the smoke, how it is being in California over the past couple of decades with the fire situation in Paso in California, how it affects the wines themselves, if you feel like it does. And also just like what, like we were talking for everyone else, we were just chatting a few minutes before everyone got on. He's saying basically that you can't go outside right now in Paso because the air quality is, you can't breathe, right?
We currently have the worst air quality in the world right now, literally in the world. All the winds are blowing north to south right now, and all the massive fires up in Big Sur and Salinas are literally blowing right through here. It's unbearable outside. I mean, you literally walk out the door and you immediately feel it in your lungs. You can't see the neighboring hill. The sun is red, if you can even see it.
It was right down here, all the way in OC this morning too.
Yeah, yesterday I didn't even see the sun pretty much for the entire day. We were it was like a thick fog almost, but it's all around us, along with it being 100 plus degrees. So that's, the fires, they didn't happen when I first started in this business. They were very small and isolated. And all of a sudden the last several years, it's become a very significant issue. We've been very lucky in Paso. The only one close to us that affected things was the 2016 Lake Nacimiento fire. That raged for a couple weeks, filled the valley with smoke. And there was really no smoke taint incidents except for the vineyards that were very close to Nacimiento, of which there are not many. Unfortunately for me, I was consulting for one of those in 2016. And we had to essentially throw out the entire crop. I made them 2 barrels of Syrah because the owner just wanted something to represent the vintage, and it tasted like an ashtray. I mean, it was literally one of the most god-awful things I've ever tried in my life. And it's a real issue. Like right now, if this lingered for a week or two, it could compromise the entire vintage. So far, supposedly the winds are supposed to change tomorrow and blow this thing out of here, and we'll be fine. But this past week, we have endured literally the worst air quality in the world right now recorded, completely inundated with smoke. And we had temperatures between 112 and 114 for the last week. And this was after a nearly perfect and mild growing season to this point. So I knew 2020 had to rear its head eventually in the viticulture side of things. But it's our first challenge. We've had to this point one of the most beautiful growing seasons I've ever seen. So, and the timing for us isn't that bad. For other wine regions that are about 2 or 3 weeks ahead of us, this timing was pretty awful for them.
Yeah.
But we were in pretty good shape to handle it. So it's supposed to cool off significantly starting tomorrow. And by Sunday, we're supposed to be in the 80s, and that's supposed to continue for a while. So should bode well for a nice recovery. But as long as the smoke blows out and we go back into the 80s here, we'll be in great shape and it'll be like it never happened. But yeah, it's definitely a scary thing every year because as a winemaker, when you smell that smoke, you know it's the potential to compromise your entire vintage. And I think my entire goal for this upcoming harvest with everything that's gone on this past year in the world was I just wanted to harvest some of the best fruit and make some of the best wines of my life so that in 2 years from now, when I'm sitting on the tasting room patio with wine club members, we can cheers glasses of 2020 wine and just hopefully laugh about it, at that point in hindsight. But there was a moment yesterday as the smoke was billowing and I was just like, 2020, you can't have the grapes. You can't take that too. You've had enough. You've taken a lot from everybody and made our lives a lot harder. But if you take that, there's nothing left for me to give you, essentially. So we'll see. Fingers are crossed in that department. But then, yeah, back to the labels question. The guy that does our labels, his name's John Blythe. I grew up with him in the same neighborhood. We've been friends since I was about 6 years old. And he went to Cal Berkeley up in the Bay Area. I moved down here, went to Cal Poly. We kind of fell out of touch for a while. And then one day when I was starting a brand, gave him a call and said, I want you to do my labels. And he was like, oh, I've never done that before. And I was like, well, your art's beautiful, so it'll be fine. And the first ones weren't, I don't think, his best work. They were still nice, but after our first vintage, we got some really good scores on our wines. And I sent him the Wine Spectator that had our scores in it. And I said, hey, look, I mean business. Like, this isn't a home winemaking thing. I want your best work. And then the next vintage, every year since then, it's just gotten better and better and better. And there's more and more detail in them. So it's nice to work with the folks. I know, right?
Insane. Just like you spend hours. Yeah, that one's one of my favorites, honestly.
Yeah, the peak pulls out all kinds of things going on. Oh, and he paints them in multiple stages so that they almost have this 3D depth to them. Because it's a painting on a painting on a painting on a painting, essentially. And so if you look at them, it goes backwards. It goes like into the painting as you kind of look at it. And I think it's such a cool effect that it has to do that. And then all the little characters in there, I'm still finding things after all these years in some of my older wines, and I look at these things all the time. So they're still a surprise even for me. The cool thing is I don't give him any rules or parameters. This is 100% him. And in any week now, I'm supposed to be getting the next set of labels for our bottling in January. And he asked me, he's like, do you want me to send you pictures? I'm like, no. I love the surprise. I love just opening that big envelope, pulling them out and seeing what he threw at me. And usually we do 10 wines a year. He'll send me about 14 or 15 pieces generally. And then we'll choose the ones, our favorite 10 essentially. And then we'll choose which ones kind of fit the personality of each wine. They're not painted for a particular wine per se. They're just 100% him organically doing his thing. And then we kind of go off feeling for us what we get feeling wise from the art and what wine we think it embodies as to what it goes with. And then that's the challenge though of making his art look identical on the bottle. So when he sends me the pieces, they go to a photographer. He photographs them down, and John never sends me pieces that are square either. So, and we have to be square or rectangular in this case. So sometimes we have to lose something to gain something essentially and cut off something. So that can be a little tricky there. But once we get a photograph, that then goes to the label design guy who then crops them properly to fit within the size of this label. Because these paintings in some cases are like 3 foot by 3 foot.
Oh my goodness.
It could be as small as like 6 inches by 6 inches. Then everything in between. So he crops them down so that they maintain their integrity. Then on print day, I actually bring the originals down and we go through each label to make sure the colors translated properly, because the ink combinations change on a yearly basis based on the manufacturing. So every year it's a different tweak to get the colors right. Then once we nail that, the paper I use has this kind of texture to it that kind of embodies the paper that he uses at the same time too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And about 2-3 vintages ago was the first year he said those look exactly like my art. And that was always the goal along the way, but it took years and years of making these little tweaks along the way to get them there. And literally you can hold them up side by side with the original now, and you can't tell the difference other than the originals, size wise, and you can see the paint strokes and all that kind of stuff. But that was the whole idea, is just to have his beautiful art on the front of the label, and then everything, all the technical stuff on the back. And it was just meant to be a talking point or just something nice to look at your dinner table.
And it is.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So I would love to chat a little bit about our beautiful Mourvedre here.
Uh-huh.
So this is now a new vineyard also, which is very exciting. And so, because I like to layer my questions on so I know what we're coming up to, obviously. But let's talk about the Mourvedre since we just have a few minutes left. And then just a quick, end with like a little bit of just the original history of the Rhône varietals in Paso, just how they actually got there, the origination of it, because it's, what, was it Randall Graham? Was it the Perrin family? Like, who actually got it all started? When did what was the impetus? But
yep,
let's chat about this.
So this wine is our Denner Vineyard Mourvedre. It's one of 3 Mourvedres we make: Denner, Glenrose, and Alta Colina. The unique thing about all of our Mourvedres is that I make them all identically, and yet all 3 taste completely different, and that's because of the terroir. The 3 Mourvedres are all 100% whole cluster, so not destemmed at all. Literally the whole bunch is picked in the vineyard, go in the fermenter. They're aged, they're punch downs only during fermentation, and then aged 14 months in neutral French oak barrels. So the distinct differences between the wine themselves are literally just the place that they come from. And all 3 taste completely different, even though they're the same variety, all grown within about a mile to mile and a half of each other and made identically. And there's literally, when you taste them all side by side, you're like, how is this even possible? Then it's literally just the translation of dirt, soil, or this is dirt, exposure, elevation, all those factors are what more than makes a wine unique on its own to that site. And I just roll with that rather than trying to make it stylistically something I want it to be. I let it be what it is, essentially. So it's more like I use the term wine shepherd rather than wine maker, because I'm really not making this. I'm just picking it when it needs to, farming it the way it needs to be farmed, picking it when it needs to be picked, bring it to the winery, letting it become wine with doing as little, if anything, as possible. And then just, again, letting the wine age by itself with no blending components whatsoever and make a beautiful standalone Mourvedre is kind of the idea with it. So that you're literally tasting the most pure expression of one grape from one single place. Again, it's the theme of kind of our brand, but the Mourvedres are the most unique one because there's 3 of them in the lineup.
Yeah.
And when you compare them all side by side, and you see how dramatically different they are. It's pretty shocking. And it also shows kind of how, when you take the winemaker's ego out of the equation, that the wines can be plenty distinct on their own, but then you start to bring in winemakers' desire for new oak or adding acid or using reverse osmosis or filtration and other techniques and things that can manipulate and change a wine. That doesn't necessarily need to happen per se. And the grapes are plenty good on their own. They're from a premium site. And in this case, I just let them be what they are, and they're beautiful on their own from that standpoint. So that's kind of our philosophy overall, while also buying and farming organic fruit or biodynamic fruit. So you get this purity in the wine is kind of the idea there.
Do you, out of curiosity, what about your yeasts? Do you use?
Yeah, yeast, that's a good question. So I don't do native yeast. The reason I don't do native yeast is because I source from multiple vineyards, and I'm also in facilities that have multiple vineyards going through them. So I can't actually do a true native yeast like a Tablas Creek can that's 100% estate. So I actually select regional yeasts from where the origins of that fruit came from.
Really?
So my Syrah originates from Côte Rôtie in the Northern Rhône. So my yeast is propagated from Northern Rhône Syrah grapes, literally, so that I'm being respectful of the origin of that fruit. My Mourvedres, most of the clonal material comes from the Languedoc. So I use a yeast sort propagated from the Languedoc. My Grenaches, that comes from Châteauneuf-du-Pape area of France. I use one that's propagated in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. My whites, I all use a Champagne yeast on, because white champagnes are have this very mineral, effusively mineral and chalky quality to them. Well, we have limestone just like champagne. So if I use their yeast, it accentuates the limestone here and makes it even more mineral in the wines, kind of thing. So that's kind of where I took the idea of being respectful of the wines by using yeast that these grapes have worked with for centuries in some cases. So that's my way of being respectful to them from that standpoint. And then you also mentioned the origin of Rhône varieties and kind of who's responsible for that. As far as Paso goes, pretty much Tablas Creek is ground zero for it, and for Rhones in general. There were some Rhones that predated them, like Gary Eberly actually planted the first Syrah in the United States, the Estrella River vineyard in the east side. And those were just suitcase cuttings, literally, that people went over there, visited with winemakers, visited vineyards. Eberly's Steinbeck Vineyard in Paso, that was the first Syrah grown in the United States, and what I call it came from suitcase cuttings. People literally went to France, went to these great vineyards, cut off cuttings, put them in their suitcase, got them through customs, and then propagated them and started growing them. But Tablas Creek, basically, when they came here, they came to the United States just trying to seek ground that they could make the wines they wanted to make. Well, they found the ground they wanted in Paso Robles. So that was our first like legitimate investment in this area. And then they made the decision as a company that they were going to import, because the Rhône clonal material in the U.S. at that time was pretty bad and not up to quality for what they wanted to do. So they're like, okay, we're going to bring over the 13 varieties permitted in Châteauneuf-du-Pape from Chateau de Beaucastel and propagate them ourselves, put them through the UC Davis quarantine, which can take 8 to 15 years, and go through that process. And just last year, they grafted over some Grenache Blanc vines to Muscardin, and they have actually just completed that journey. And all 13 Châteauneuf-du-Pape varietals are now currently growing in the United States. And when the Muscardin gives its first crop, I think they might have some clusters on it this year, they'll have harvested fruit from all 13 Châteauneuf-du-Pape varieties. And that took them over 30 years to do that. And I thank them for that.
Yeah, right. Because that, I mean, they are the source. So it is the Perrin family. It is the Tablas Creek that is the.
Yeah, it was the Perrin family of Chateau de Beaucastel, and then Bob Haas, who owned Vineyard Brands, which was one of the best European importers back in the 60s and 70s, even up till now. And so there was a partnership between the two, and we're just lucky they picked Paso. And something like 90% of all Rhône variety plantings in the United States originated from Tablas Creek clones. It's some crazy number like that. So, I mean, almost all my wines come from their clonal material, minus a couple of them. And so it's extremely special what they did, and that it was extremely expensive too. They actually lost a ton of money just doing that. But at all of our benefits of getting those here. So like last night I tried they just released their first Bourboulon, and Bourboulon is one of the obscure Rhône varietals, and they just got their first crop last year. It was the first one in the history of the United States. And I was drinking it last night at the kitchen table, just going like, you're just drinking history, literally. It's such a cool thing, the journey that goes to getting that here.
God, that is so cool. Well, it is 4:03 now. I would just like, Ryan, you're awesome. Thank you. This has been so delightful, and you've been wonderful to talk to. I would talk to you for like 2 more hours, but we all have
Yeah, these things tend to go pretty quick, but I like to kind of break down the pretentious side of the wine business and just kind of talk to you folks like normal everyday people, because it's the end of the day, it's what I am, and it's what we do. It's just sometimes I think the wine industry does a terrible job of using normal language and speaking about things, and everybody tries to, I don't know, there's just this fancy hoity-toity kind of language that comes in the wine industry all the time, especially up in Napa. And people from Paso like myself are just kind of real everyday people that just kind of make wine for a living. And so I love to kind of explain it in just more of a normal way without all the pretentiousness and things like that. Yeah. And, wine doesn't have to be like that.
I love Paso for that reason. Deborah's just asking how I found you, and I would like to share the story just as a final kind of note. It's funny, and you don't know Ryan, so you're like, I don't remember. So when I was up in Paso and we were just doing some general tastings, and we were actually at L'Aventure, and our tasting girl was like, you should really try Ryan's wines. He doesn't have a winery. He's pouring out of the barrel room at Grey Wolf, and she gave us your cell phone number. And she's like, call him, see if he's pouring that day. And we're like, oh, okay. And we called, you're like, yep, I'm pouring. You can come over. And then you did. And that was how. And now you have, obviously, your tasting room, which opened 2 years ago, I think, right?
Yeah, well, this is year 3 for us, yeah.
Year 3, okay. Yeah, and I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful little house. I think that's a whole nother story. I think the best way, everyone, is just to go up there and visit it yourself.
Okay. Come visit.
All right, I will let you all Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Ryan, so much. I really appreciate your insight, and it's been wonderful to talk. Have a wonderful evening with your family and weekend. Everyone else, have a great weekend, and I'll see you later.
It was a pleasure.
Take care. Bye, everyone.